Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Occupational Therapy and Eating Disorders: The Practical Side of Healing. My name is Louise, and I'm here today with my placement partner, Natasha. We're occupational therapy students. We recently completed our fieldwork placement at Sheena's Place, which, as you may already know, we're a community-based organization that offers group support for individuals affected by eating disorders. And just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Louise. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an OT student from the University of Toronto. I have a strong passion for mental health and found eating disorders particularly interesting. But OT isn't always the first profession that comes to mind when we think of eating disorder support. But during my time here at Sheena's Place, I've noticed how much OT could contribute, especially when it comes to practical, day-to-day support and helping people reconnect with parts of life outside of the eating disorder. So I've been really grateful for my time to learn here, and I'm really excited to be sharing this webinar with you.
Hi, I'm Natasha. My pronouns are she, her. And like Louise, I'm a student occupational therapist at the University of Toronto doing my placement here at Sheena's Place. My time on this placement has been my first opportunity to engage with the area of eating disorders in a professional or academic setting. But in my personal life, I've been researching and writing about eating disorders and diet culture for many years. It's a topic that's very important to me. I'm especially passionate about improving resources for and representation of populations that tend to be sidelined when it comes to eating disorder support. And I'm also passionate about raising awareness for eating disorder interventions that are practical and holistic. So, like Louise, I'm really excited to share today's session with you, and we're looking forward to exploring the ways that OT can support individuals navigating eating disorders through strategies that are meaningful and grounded in everyday life.
We'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the land from which we're joining you today. As we are based in Toronto, we acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and that this land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As occupational therapy students working in eating disorder support, we reflect on how the land, our bodies, and our communities are deeply interconnected. Eating disorders often disrupt a person's relationship to their body, their rhythms, and the everyday activities that give life meaning. OT focuses on rebuilding those connections in gentle, supportive, and practical ways through daily routines, identity, and participation in community life. But these ideas are not new. Indigenous communities have long known and practiced holistic, relational approaches to well being, centering land, culture, and interdependence. We acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonialism on Indigenous communities and the ways those same systems affect access to care and shape who feels safe, seen, and supported in healthcare spaces today. We're committed to continue to learn, unlearn, and ground our practice in values of respect, cultural humility, and collective care. If you're joining us from a different place, we invite you to take a moment to reflect on the lands you're on and the Indigenous peoples who continue to steward them.
So, what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to take a look at what eating disorders are and how they impact daily life. Then we're going to talk about what occupational therapy is and the general role that an occupational therapy approach can play in supporting those living with eating disorders. Then we're going to go through some common strategies used in OT and how they might look in real life using case examples. And then we'll go through next steps for anyone interested in finding an OT. Before we jump into content, we just want to acknowledge that we know you're all coming from different places. You might be a practitioner, you might have a loved one with an eating disorder, you might have lived experience, and you might carry multiple identities at once. We do want to flag that a few of our topics can be difficult, especially for those with lived experience. And again, this is a webinar and not a support space. So we won't be following Sheena's Place language guidelines that community members at Sheena's Place are used to. We want to give a heads up about those things and flag that early on in this presentation, we'll be exploring some specifics of how eating disorders can affect different areas of a person's life. And later on in our case examples, we'll be naming different disorders. So we encourage you to take care of yourself in whatever way you need. whether that means taking breaks, to mute or fast forward the presentation during sections that aren't for you, or to just leave the presentation if you're finding that it's not meeting you where you're at today. So, to get started, what is an eating disorder? Sheena's Place uses this definition. An eating disorder is a type of mental health challenge that involves extreme food or weight preoccupation and eating behaviors that are harmful to physical and mental health. So, most of us will be familiar with this general concept, but because eating is in the name of the disorder, it can be easy to only think of food and weight when we consider the areas of life affected by eating disorders. And it's actually a lot more than that. An eating disorder doesn't just shape how someone eats, but also how they think and what they think about, how they perceive themselves and the world around them, how much energy they have, their values and priorities, what activities they engage in, and more. Overall, an eating disorder can affect every aspect of someone's life. So, for those coming without lived experience, it might be difficult to imagine how some of these areas shown on this slide can be impacted by an eating disorder. So, we'd like to touch on some of the ways that this could look. In this section, I'm going to give some really specific examples. So, if this might be triggering for you, I invite you to skip forward or to mute until we move on to the next slide. So, one area of life that can be affected by eating disorder experiences is social life and relationships. Some people might find themselves pulling away from friends or family or feeling less connected. That disconnection can be unintentional, as sometimes symptoms take up a lot of energy or attention, making it hard to be present with others. There can also be complications when loved ones are aware of the disorder, because a lack of knowledge or understanding can lead to ineffective or even harmful attempts at support. This is especially true for those who don't fit the stereotypical image of someone with an eating disorder. Like if they're male or genderqueer or at an older age or living in a larger body. And even when loved ones are providing the best support possible, it can be distressful for someone living with an eating disorder to feel observed when symptoms are ongoing, or to be compelled towards recovery when they aren't ready yet. Eating disorder challenges can also show up in responsibilities like school, work, social, or personal commitments. When someone's energy is low or their mind feels consumed by thoughts of their eating disorder, tasks that were at one time manageable might start to feel overwhelming or fall to the side. This can affect someone's confidence and identity, especially when they feel like they're not meeting expectations. Self-care is another area that can be affected. Sometimes people may feel that they don't deserve rest or kindness, or they may feel disconnected from their body's needs. Daily routines like sleep and hygiene can be disrupted because of factors such as physical discomfort, low energy, or emotional distress. And the last example we want to touch on, although there are many more, is sexuality and intimacy. Eating disorders can shape how someone feels in or about their body, which may affect comfort with touch, desire, or trust in intimate relationships. For some people, this might mean a decrease in sexual interests or discomfort with physical closeness. For others, the eating disorder may lead to complicated feelings around control, vulnerability, or shame. So, for those with lived experience, hearing these things laid out might feel discouraging, but we hope it can instead serve as validation that first, you are not alone, and second, that it makes sense if it's difficult. It makes sense that living with or recovering from an eating disorder is challenging and complicated, and sometimes a long process. And it also makes sense that you might need support specifically in navigating the complexities of day-to-day life, like relationships, time use, school, hobbies, and more. Psychotherapy and physiological or nutritional interventions are the most common approaches to eating disorder recovery, and they are incredibly important. But they sometimes don't address these practical sides of everyday functioning and all of the questions and uncertainty that can come with them. And so this is why it also makes sense that those living with eating disorders might need practical support in addition to other kinds. And one kind of practical support can be occupational therapy. OT can help to bridge that space, focusing on the parts of life that are practical, meaningful, and deeply personal.
So, what is occupational therapy? Occupational therapy, or OT, is a form of healthcare that supports individuals in engaging in their meaningful activities, or what we call occupations, things that can occupy your time. And this can include everything from self-care tasks to school or work to social participation and more. You may have heard of the quote here, medicine adds days to life, occupational therapy adds life to days. What this means is, while medical care often focuses on stabilizing your body, occupational therapy helps you get back to the things that make life feel like yours. We support people in participating in roles that matter to them and rediscovering the parts of life that bring joy, purpose, and connection. Occupational therapy is also holistic, meaning that OTs won't just consider one aspect of an individual's well-being in isolation, but rather in relation to each other. So, for example, occupational therapy relies on the understanding that physical and mental health are intricately linked and are shaped by social determinants of health, like income, access to healthcare, living situation, and more. And in other words, OT sees the whole person and their context, not just a diagnosis. OTs also use a framework called the PEO model, meaning that they consider the person, the environment to understand what's happening, and the occupation or activity, and what each of these components mean. So the person component includes the individual's emotions, identity, physical health, cognitive abilities, and values. The environment includes not just your physical spaces, but also your social supports, community, and culture. Occupation, again, refers to the activities and roles that fill your day, and it can be further split into three types. There's self-care, which includes dressing and personal hygiene, productivity, such as school, work, and leisure, such as hobbies, relaxation, socializing. When something feels difficult or overwhelming, it's often because one or more of these areas is at a mismatch with the person or their environment. OTs use this framework to explore where the challenges are and they use it to inform how they can offer support. And they recognize that it's not always the person who needs to make a change, it's something sometimes about changing the environment or how the activity is approached. So bringing it back to eating disorder recovery, when we look at these different questions that folks living with eating disorders have to navigate, like how to get through the day, how to navigate environments that may be triggering for them, how to practice self-care and go to work or school. Occupational therapists are positioned really well to address these gaps in support or care and to come up with concrete and actionable answers to these questions. We focus on function. So, looking at what's important to you, what's hard right now, and how we can support you in doing the things you want or need to do. We also want to emphasize that while OT can support with the recovery process, OT approaches and strategies can also help bring meaning and stability into someone's life as they live with these symptoms. Eating disorder recovery can be a long and complicated process, and it's understandable if progress sometimes feels slow, uncertain, or nonlinear. Our focus is on helping individuals not only survive, but reconnect with a life that feels meaningful, doable, and worth living, no matter where they are in the stages of recovery.
So, in this next section, we're going to go over just some of the ways that an occupational therapy approach could be integrated into someone's ED recovery. We'll be sharing specific examples to show how OT strategies might look in action, but they are flexible tools, so they can be adapted to different needs and situations. We also want to point out that while occupational therapists are the experts in these strategies and can provide person-centered step-by-step support, people can also draw ideas from these tools and implement them on their own. So if you're someone with lived experience interested in an occupational therapy approach, but you're experiencing access barriers, we still hope that learning about these approaches and tools can support you on your journey. So the first strategy we want to talk about is goal setting. This might sound like a very simple strategy, and in many ways it is, but the reality is that, like we acknowledged earlier, eating disorders can be overwhelming. It's common for people to know that they're dissatisfied or unhappy with something, but not know what to do about it. Setting a goal can help someone shift overwhelm or dissatisfaction into a specific vision for change. An occupational therapist can support with practical aspects of the goal setting process. This might include processes like challenging cognitive distortions. Sometimes an individual holds false or inconsistent beliefs that will keep them from imagining that they can achieve a certain goal. An OT can work with an individual to identify where these distortions might be getting in the way of setting an important goal. An OT can also support an individual in identifying the difference between their current situation and their ideal situation, and then equip them to identify which aspects of that gap are changeable. People are often distracted by the aspects of their situation that are out of their control. And OTs can come alongside people to identify what is in their control and how they can change it. Another aspect of how an OT can support with goal setting is a strengths-based approach. A strengths-based approach means starting with what somebody already does well and then building on what's already working to support meaningful change. An OT can guide someone to remember what strategies they've used in the past, to identify which strategies have or haven't been successful, and to make modifications or to adapt them to the current situation. OTs recognize that individuals are the experts on themselves and that they often possess many of the tools to make changes. They just may need support in recognizing those tools and then implementing them. Another strategy that OTs use in goal setting is the SMART approach. You may have heard of SMART goals before. OTs are definitely not the only ones who use them, but OTs are experts in supporting individuals to develop and implement them. After supporting an individual to identify areas where goals can be useful, an OT can support individuals in ensuring that those goals are as useful and feasible as possible. So for those of you who haven't heard of SMART goals before, SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. When a goal is designed with these points in mind, it makes it easier to pursue because the desired outcome is clearly defined and the goal setter has paid close attention to what's achievable and within their capacity. But it's also important to remember that goals are meant to serve the people who make them, which means that it's okay to adapt them as new information is learned. An OT can support individuals in setting SMART goals for meaningful living and then to assess when the goal needs to be adjusted. A graded approach is one strategy that OTs use to support individuals in achieving their goals once they've set them. A graded approach gradually modifies the difficulty of an activity as an individual's capacity, skill level, or abilities change. Goals can often seem unachievable because people are starting in a place that is just at a mismatch for their capacity or ability. Just like it wouldn't make sense for a beginner gymnast to try and learn a backflip in their first ever session, it doesn't make sense to tackle a challenge from the most difficult angle possible. OTs can support individuals in adapting a task or strategy to a level that feels doable, and then gradually adjusting the task or strategy as the individual adapts to it. So let's take a look at an example of how these strategies could be used in real life. We're going to use a case scenario and throughout we're going to use case scenarios that are fictional, but that reflect real challenges people face when navigating eating disorders, and that reflect one way that an OT might approach the situation. So I'm going to introduce you to Leo. Leo is a 22-year-old college student who is struggling with body dissatisfaction and his relationship to physical activity. When he was in high school, he loved taking dance classes and playing on sports teams. But as he developed body dysmorphia and orthorexia, he became anxious and self-conscious during movement, and his relationship with these activities became compensatory and punitive. He eventually stopped most kinds of exercise as a part of his recovery. It's now several years later, and Leo wants to begin exploring movement again. But he feels too self-conscious about his body to do physical activities in front of others, and he's also nervous that he'll start using exercise punitively again. So Leo goes to an OT in the community to seek support to re-engage with movement in a way that feels comfortable and safe. So Leo's OT supports him in identifying exactly what he's hoping for by asking questions about his priorities and values in this area. The OT asks Leo questions like, what activity does Leo miss the most? Are there any specific activities that he associates more with compensation or punishment? What setting triggers the least thoughts around competition or comparison? What activity used to bring him the most joy? Through these questions and others like them, Leo decides that he most misses doing group dance classes, like the ones that he used to do in school. And it's also the activity that he least associates with compensation or punishment. But the thought of jumping straight into an in person class currently makes Leo feel anxious and dysregulated. So Leo and the OT develop a SMART goal. Within 3 months, Leo will attend a 45-minute in person dance class in his community. Leo and his OT recognize that building up his capacity and starting with what feels safe is the best approach for working towards this end goal. So they decide to use a graded approach. Together, they choose a sequence that feels doable. First, he starts dancing alone at home along to YouTube videos. Once he's comfortable doing that, he transitions to doing a live online class with his camera off, and then to a live online class with his camera on. And finally, when he feels ready, he begins to attend in person classes. So that was Leo and his story. I'll now pass it on to Louise to look at our next set of strategies.
Thank you, Natasha. So now thinking back to the PEO model we talked about before, sometimes the activity itself isn't the challenge, it's how we approach it or the environment we're trying to do it in. So in occupational therapy, we support people by adjusting the setup of a task or modifying their environment to reduce stress and increase comfort. So, for example, if eating with others at meals feels overwhelming, an OT might work with someone to adapt the situation, like choosing a seat that feels less exposed, or eating with one supportive person instead of a big group, or starting with shorter meals. Rather than avoiding meals altogether, we adapt how and where the activity happens to make participation feel safer and more achievable. These adjustments don't change the goal, but they can make it feel a lot more possible. OTs also look into sensory-based strategies, so they're ways of using your senses like touch, sound, movement, or smell, and they help regulate your body. And these are especially helpful for people who feel disconnected from their body or overwhelmed by physical sensations or stuck in anxious or shut down states. OT helps individuals explore which sensations feel soothing, energizing, or regulating, and how to build those into everyday routines. For example, we might offer suggestions for someone to carry a grounding object in their pocket, or use a calming scent before a stressful task, or take a sensory pause between activities. Next, we have emotional regulation strategies. Again, these aren't unique to OT, and you might see them in psychotherapy or other forms of support too. But in occupational therapy, we often focus on how emotions show up during daily tasks and how to support someone in moving through those movements without getting stuck. And sometimes that means working before a task even starts, like using visual aids to plan ahead for ways to make a situation feel safer, or choosing when and how to approach a challenge. Other times, we focus during or after an activity, like using breathing and grounding techniques if tough emotions arise. And because OT often involves doing the task together, we can support people in the moment, naming what's coming up, trying out different tools, and building emotional capacity in real time. And these strategies aren't about avoiding emotions, but about creating enough safety and support to move through them while still engaging in meaningful activities. So let's take a look at another case example. This is Maya. She's 17 and recently admitted to an inpatient eating disorder program after a diagnosis of bulimia nervosa. And while the team is helping her with medical stabilization, there are still parts of the day that feel incredibly overwhelming. And one of those is getting dressed in the morning. And for Maya, even something like choosing what to wear brings up a flood of distress, anxiety, negative body image, and sensory discomfort. She said, I don't even want to look in the mirror, and it feels easier to stay in bed. And these aren't just bad mornings, these are moments when everyday life feels unmanageable. But this is where occupational therapy steps in, not to take over, but to gently support Maya in making mornings feel safer, calmer, and a little more possible. So Maya's OT started by making environmental adaptations to help reduce stress. That included repositioning or covering her mirror, using softer lighting in the room, and narrowing down her clothing choices to just a few cozy, familiar options. They also introduced sensory-based strategies, like having Maya choose soft textures she felt safe in, listening to a calming playlist while getting dressed, or holding a warm object like a heat pack. For emotional regulation, the OT used something called the zones of regulation. So, this is a simple color coded tool that helps people check in with how they're feeling. Green for calm, yellow for anxious, blue for low, red for overwhelmed. Maya would check in using the system before and after getting dressed, which helped her recognize what was coming up and choosing a strategy to support herself, like a few calming breaths, or asking for more help, or adjusting the task. So instead of pushing through the distress, this helped Maya slow down and recognize what she was feeling and feel more in control of her morning. All these supports together made mornings feel more manageable and gave Maya a sense of control in a space that previously felt really hard. Now let's move on to the final set of strategies, energy management. Many people with eating disorders describe feeling mentally and physically exhausted, especially when trying to re-engage with life outside of the eating disorder. In OT, we support people in understanding their energy patterns and planning their days in a way that balances effort and rest. That might mean spreading tasks out more gently, scheduling breaks ahead of time, or even identifying which types of activities are most draining or replenishing. It's all about helping people go about their activities in a more sustainable way, which could include helping people identify which activities are most important and meaningful to them, and which tasks can be adapted, postponed, or even let go of when needed. Also in OT, we often run skills-based groups, like things like cooking, shopping, socializing, or planning your week. These aren't about performance or doing things the right way. They're about learning through doing, one step at a time. So we might break down the task, explore where it's getting tricky, and work through it together, offering a more structured and support along the way. This can be a little bit different from some other kinds of groups you might see at Sheena's place, where the emphasis may be more on discussion and reflection. OT groups do include reflection, but we pair that with real-time practice and experimentation. And often people in these groups, they discover that they're not alone in the challenges they're facing. And there's something really validating about realizing, oh, it's not just me who finds this hard. So to go through this in a case scenario, this is Jordan. They're 42 and currently working with an OT in an outpatient program after stepping down from more intensive care for anorexia nervosa. Jordan shared that they miss volunteering at their local community garden. It used to be a space of calm and connection and something that felt like them. But now, without the rigid structure that their eating disorder once imposed, the days feel unstructured and overwhelming. And even just getting out the door feels like too much. Jordan said, I'm exhausted before I even leave the house. There's a deep desire to re engage, but also a sense of being stuck. Let's take a look at how OT helped Jordan build confidence and reconnect with this meaningful role. So, Jordan's OT started with energy management, helping them map out a weekly schedule that included both higher effort tasks like volunteering at the garden, as well as lower demand activities like reading or taking a walk. They also built in planned rest breaks, especially after physically or socially demanding days. They also worked on skill support through everyday activities. So, for example, Jordan's OT worked with them to prepare a small kit with any tools they need the night before going gardening, so the morning felt less rushed. They used a short checklist to keep things simple and added a calming transition before they were heading out the door, like a stretch or a music break. Jordan also attended a skills-based group led by an OT, focused on flexible scheduling and routine planning. In group sessions, Jordan practiced mapping out a realistic morning routine, estimating how long tasks might take, and troubleshooting what to do if something didn't go to plan, like if the weather changed or their energy dipped unexpectedly. These small, structured steps help Jordan feel more equipped to return to something meaningful and to do it in a way that felt sustainable.
So now that you have a sense of what OT can offer, how do you actually find an OT who works in this space? You can find us in a lot of different settings, in hospitals and inpatient programs, in day treatment or outpatient ED programs, community health clinics and services, private practices, schools or university accessibility services, and often virtual services in all these different areas. If you're in Canada, a great starting place is the NEDIC, the National Eating Disorder Information Center Provider Directory, which includes mental health and eating disorder informed professionals across disciplines. You can filter the credentials by selecting an occupational therapist. If you live in Ontario, you can also use the Find an OT tool through the Ontario Society of Occupational Therapists, and then filter by finding an OT that works with the eating disorders population. And lastly, there is a Find an OT tool through the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists website. You can't directly filter for an OT that works with eating disorders directly, but you can filter through OTs that work in mental health and then go from there. So when you're reaching out to an OT, it can be helpful to have some questions ready to help determine if someone is the right fit for you. You might ask questions about their specific approach, like, how do you work with clients on day-to-day challenges like routines and roles? Can you support me with returning to school, managing energy, getting back to art, navigating challenging events or environments, and other personal goals? You might also ask questions around expectations when working with the OT. Depending on the setting or where you're looking for the OT, they might have a specific number of sessions they're allowed to see clients for. So you can ask something like, how long do you usually see clients? Do you have a session cap? You could also ask questions to help figure out if they have the experience or knowledge that you would like in a provider. It's completely appropriate to ask something like, do you have experience supporting clients with eating disorders or disordered eating? You can also ask about your specific disorder or symptoms, as different disorders might require different forms of support. An OT not having experience with eating disorder support doesn't mean that they're automatically not going to be able to support you, but you might want to be more intentional with other questions about the framework that they're working from. For example, you could ask about their understanding of diet culture and how it impacts eating disorders, or about their knowledge of weight bias and fat phobia in the healthcare system. Just like other healthcare providers, not every OT will come with the same lens. So asking questions like these beforehand can help you find someone whose values align with yours. Ultimately, every OT works a little bit differently, so it's okay to ask questions and see if the fit feels right for you. So before we wrap up, we want to leave you with a few key takeaways. First, eating disorders don't just affect food and body image. They affect how someone functions day to day. This can include routines, roles, and how someone rests, connects, or expresses themselves. This impact is often broad and deeply personal. Second, occupational therapy can help address the practical side of recovery. That might mean making everyday tasks more manageable, reconnecting with meaningful activities, or supporting someone as they rebuild a sense of identity beyond the eating disorder. This can include specific strategies like the ones that we looked at today, like a graded approach or emotional regulation. These are all flexible and grounded in what matters to each person. And finally, OTs can work across multiple settings, but can meet someone wherever they're at. Whether someone is actively in recovery, in treatment, or still living with symptoms, OT can bring stability, meaning, and support into their everyday life.
Thank you for spending this time with us. We hope this gave you a better understanding of OT's role in eating disorder support and maybe even spark some curiosity about how this kind of care could fit into your own or someone else's journey. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Sheena's Place and contact us. Thank you.